There are actually many different definitions for the word scumbling, and in some cases they aren't even very similar. So for this course, I'd like to establish an independent definition. Let's define it as a stroke where a fairly dry brush skips over the painting surface in a haphazard way in order to create a textured effect and allow some of the base layer to show through. One of the earliest artists to use this stroke was John Constable when he painted his clouded skies. This piece by Theodore Rousseau is another great example of how scumbling can be used for skies. Scumbling can be done using any level of dilution, and really any level of brush load. A brush that's loaded to the maximum will produce an impasto or a kind of solid scumble. One that's barely loaded will produce a haphazard, dry brush kind of look. Each level of brush load will give a slightly different look. The surface is typically dry, but you can scumble over wet paint with oils. As mentioned, scumbling is a nice brush stroke when depicting texture in a painting, especially for the landscape artist. Scumbling can be used when painting grasses. It can be used in abstracts or to paint still life objects. This painting appears to consist almost entirely of scumble strokes. It's really amazing. My preferred brush for scumbling is a round, a medium round to be specific, and that goes for both watercolor and oil. When I scumble, I'm not usually looking for straight lines, but rather sporadic rounded marks. I use a moderately loaded brush so that it can deposit enough paint, and I usually lay it fairly flat along the surface. Laying it flat allows me to get a more spontaneous look, rather than the precision that an upright brush would give me. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Here I'm holding my brush upright, and now I'm laying it on its side. Notice the difference in the marks. The preferred motion is kind of a bouncy, slightly scrubby action, all with a delicate touch. Remember that you're not looking for solid coverage. You actually want some of the bottom layer to show through, because that can give you some very interesting layering effects. In this example, I'm letting each layer of color dry before adding the next color or value. This creates dimension and a complex textural effect that you can't achieve when you paint wet and wet, at least in water media paints. A little earlier we mentioned a flat brush. Well, let's take a look at the mark that it would make. You can see here I'm using the same motion, but the shape of the brush head affects the mark. I use the flat edge as well as the side bristles. You can see that it has a different look, but in some cases that may be what you're looking for. If you use a small brush, such as this small round, you get a smaller mark that looks a little bit like a dry brush stroke. The difference is that you have more control over where the mark lays down with a scumble stroke. And finally, you can even use a rigger brush. This is my second favorite brush for scumbling because it can create very unusual texture. I especially like it for landscape texture. Brush load affects the mark that's created as well. Watch as we begin scumbling with a moderately loaded brush. As we move along, and I'm not reloading the brush, the bristles slowly empty of their paint and the resulting marks change. This is because the brush has less and less paint to distribute. So we're using the same motion, but there's less paint. Now, what happens if we dilute the paint a bit? The result is the same kind of scumbling mark, but a lighter value and tone. The thinner the paint, the lighter the mark. We mentioned that the preferred surface condition is dry, but let's look at what happens when you apply this stroke to a wet surface. In watercolor, it creates a soft, mottled look. And finally, another variant is to use the side of your brush to create the mark. If you sweep it upwards, you can get something resembling kind of a feathered, scumbled look. Experiment with your own brushes. Each one will offer you unique capabilities. In the next video, we'll discuss scumbling with oil paints.